I grew up with a father who treated ordinary advice like sacred law. Most parents told their children not to wander too far from camp or not to talk to strangers. My father did the same, but he always spoke with a seriousness that made the rules feel more important than simple safety advice. I grew up spending nearly every summer in Yellowstone. My father loved the place in a way I never completely understood. He loved the forests, the mountains, the lakes, and the silence that settled over the valleys before sunrise. By the time I turned 10, I'd probably spent more nights sleeping under the Yellowstone sky than I had sleeping in hotels. Every trip followed the same routine. We would arrive early in the morning, set up camp before noon, spend the afternoon hiking, and return before sunset. The rules always came after dinner. At first, I assumed they were normal wilderness precautions. Stay on marked trails. Never approach wildlife. Do not wander away from camp. The older I became, the stranger the rules became. Rule 1 was simple. If I ever heard my name coming from the trees, I was to keep walking and pretend I hadn't heard it. My father explained that sound carried strangely in the mountains, and that people often imagined things when they were tired. That explanation satisfied me when I was 8. It stopped making sense when I turned 12 and realized he repeated the rule every single year. Rule 2 was even stranger. If the forest suddenly became quiet, I was to stop whatever I was doing and return to camp immediately. Immediately. My father claimed animals often went silent before storms. I accepted that explanation until one afternoon when I noticed him checking the trees around us after the birds stopped singing. He looked nervous. Rule 3 was the one that stayed with me the longest. If I ever saw an animal standing on 2 legs, I was not supposed to run. I was not supposed to approach it. I was not supposed to look at it for longer than a few seconds. I was supposed to walk away and keep my eyes on the trail. I laughed when I first heard that one. My father didn't. He simply repeated the rule and moved on. As the years passed, more rules appeared. Never whistle after sunset. Never leave the tent between 2 and 4 in the morning unless it was an emergency. If another campsite appeared where there wasn't one before, keep walking. If I saw someone wearing park ranger clothing near our campsite after midnight, I was supposed to check for a vehicle before speaking to them. According to my father, real rangers never walked through the woods alone at night. I stopped asking questions when I was 13, not because I believed him, because I realized he believed every single word he was saying. The rules followed us every summer. They became as much a part of Yellowstone as the geysers and the hot springs. Eventually, I stopped noticing them. Children have a remarkable ability to accept strange things as normal when they grow up around them. By the time I reached adulthood, the rules had become nothing more than odd memories from family camping trips. Then my father died. The funeral was small. Most of the people who attended were old friends from hiking groups and camping clubs I barely remembered meeting as a child. A week after everything was over, I found myself sorting through boxes in his garage. Most contained exactly what I expected. Old photographs, fishing equipment, maps, camping supplies. Then I found the notebook. It was buried beneath a stack of folded trail maps and wrapped in a plastic bag as though someone had wanted to protect it from water damage. The cover was worn from years of use. Across the front, written in my father's handwriting, were 6 words: Yellowstone rules for the children. I smiled when I first saw it. I assumed it was some kind of joke. Maybe a list he had written for me and forgotten about years earlier. I opened the notebook expecting to find the same rules I had heard my entire childhood. The first page changed my mind immediately. Each rule had a date written beside it. Some dates stretched back more than 40 years. Others were much older. The oldest entry had been written in a different handwriting entirely. The date beside it was June 1947. The first rule on the page was familiar. If you hear your name coming from the trees, do not answer. Beneath it, in handwriting that did not belong to my father, was a single sentence. 3 children ignored this rule during the summer of 1947. Only 2 returned. At first, I assumed my father had collected the stories himself. He had spent decades hiking through Yellowstone and had known people from all over the country through camping clubs and outdoor groups. It seemed reasonable that he might have written down old campfire stories simply because he found them interesting. That explanation lasted until I turned the page. The second rule was written in my father's handwriting. If the forest becomes silent, return to camp immediately. Underneath it was another note. Summer of 1962. A father and son continued fishing after the birds stopped singing. The father returned alone 3 hours later and refused to explain what happened to his son. He never entered the park again. The next page contained Rule 3. If you see an animal standing on 2 legs, do not run. This one had 3 separate dates written beneath it. Each date was followed by a short sentence. Each sentence ended the same way. Witness disappeared. Witness missing. Witness never located. I stopped reading and closed the notebook. For the first time since my father's funeral, I found myself wishing he were still alive just so I could ask him what any of it meant. Instead, all I had was a notebook full of warnings and disappearances stretching back generations. I should have put it back into the box and forgotten about it. Instead, I kept reading. The next rule caught my attention immediately. Never whistle after sunset. No explanation followed. No story, no date. Just the rule itself. The page after that was even stranger. If you see another campsite where yours should be, leave immediately and do not look back. Below it was a single line written in faded blue ink. It will usually look better than your own. I stared at that sentence longer than any of the others. The wording bothered me. Whoever wrote it had not been warning about getting lost. They had been warning about making a choice. I spent almost 2 hours going through the notebook. By the time I finished, I had counted 13 rules. Some had dates, some had stories, some had only names. Several pages had been torn out entirely. One rule had been crossed out so aggressively that the paper had nearly ripped apart beneath the pen. I could still make out a few words. If you meet someone on the trail who already knows your name, the rest had been destroyed. That bothered me more than any of the other entries. People do not destroy harmless information. They destroy things they wish they had never learned. I placed the notebook on the garage table and walked away from it. For several days, I tried convincing myself the whole thing was nothing more than an old collection of folklore. National parks attracted stories. People disappeared in the wilderness every year. Missing hikers became ghost stories. Animal attacks became legends. The human mind loved turning tragedy into mystery. Then I opened my laptop. I searched for Yellowstone disappearances. The first few results were exactly what I expected. Hikers who wandered off trails. People who underestimated weather conditions. Tourists who approached wildlife. Then I noticed something strange. The details repeated. Several witnesses described sudden silence before disappearances. Others mentioned hearing voices in areas where no one else should have been. One report described a group of campers claiming they saw lights moving through the forest without any visible source. Another mentioned a missing child who insisted someone had been calling his name from the trees before he vanished. I sat back in my chair. Individually, none of those stories meant anything. Together, they felt uncomfortably familiar. My father had not invented the rules. He had inherited them. The realization should have been enough for me to put the notebook away forever. Instead, I made the mistake that started everything. I decided to go back. Part of me wanted answers. Part of me wanted proof that the notebook was nonsense. Mostly, I wanted to stand in the same forests my father had loved and convince myself that grief was making patterns where none existed. 2 weeks later, I loaded my father's old camping gear into my truck and started driving toward Yellowstone. The notebook sat in the passenger seat the entire way. I told myself I was bringing it for sentimental reasons. I knew I was lying to myself. As the mountains began appearing on the horizon, I noticed something tucked into the back cover that I had somehow missed before. It was a folded piece of paper. On it, in my father's handwriting, was a sentence I had never heard him say during my entire childhood. The rules are for children because adults stopped listening to them. The entrance to Yellowstone looked exactly the way I remembered it. The long lines of vehicles waiting at the gate, the families taking photographs beside the signs, and the endless stream of tourists unloading cameras before they had even parked their cars all felt strangely comforting. For the first time since leaving home, I started feeling embarrassed about the notebook sitting beside me. It was difficult to take old ghost stories seriously, while standing among hundreds of vacationing families buying souvenirs and ice cream. The park looked normal. The people looked normal. The rules suddenly felt ridiculous again. I drove deeper into the park until I reached one of the campgrounds my father used to visit when I was younger. The layout had barely changed over the years. The same roads curved between the trees. The same campsites sat beneath towering pines. Even the wooden information board near the entrance looked familiar. I spent the next hour setting up camp. The process came back to me faster than I expected. My father had taken me camping often enough that muscle memory did most of the work. By late afternoon, the tent was standing, the supplies were unpacked, and dinner was cooking over a small camp stove. For the first time in weeks, I felt relaxed. The notebook stayed inside my truck. I had no intention of opening it again. That changed just before sunset. The family camping across from me had 2 children, a boy who looked around 8 and a girl who could not have been older than 6. Their parents spent most of the evening helping them roast marshmallows while the children chased each other around the campsite. It was the sort of scene that existed in every camping brochure ever printed. Then I heard the father speak. He was not talking loudly, but the campground was quiet enough for the words to carry. He was giving the children rules. At first, I paid little attention. Stay close to camp. Never approach wildlife. Tell us where you're going. Normal parenting advice. Then I heard one that made me look up immediately. If someone calls your name from the trees, come back to camp and find us first. The children nodded as though they had heard the rule before. The father continued, if the woods ever become quiet, stop what you're doing and come back immediately. Another nod. Another familiar rule. I looked up from my food. The father noticed me watching and gave an awkward smile before continuing as though nothing unusual had happened. A few minutes later, I heard another one. If a ranger ever approaches your tent after dark, ask where they parked their vehicle. The boy asked a question I couldn't hear. The father answered quietly. The children seemed satisfied with the response. The conversation ended there. I sat motionless for several seconds. My father was not the only person teaching these rules. The realization stayed with me long after the family disappeared into their tent for the night. As darkness settled over the campground, I noticed something else. Almost every family with children had their own version of the rules. Some spoke openly. Others lowered their voices. A few simply reminded their children of things they had probably heard dozens of times before. Stay on the trails. Do not whistle after sunset. Never enter another campsite without permission. If the animals stop making noise, find an adult immediately. One family repeated a rule I had never seen in my father's notebook. If you wake up and hear someone walking around outside your tent, count the footsteps before opening the zipper. If there are more footsteps leaving than arriving, stay inside until morning. That one stayed with me. The parents treated it with the same seriousness as every other rule. No one laughed. No one treated it like a game. The children accepted it the same way children accept rules about crossing roads or wearing seatbelts, as though it had simply always existed. The campground slowly grew quieter as people settled in for the night. The sun disappeared behind the mountains. The temperature dropped. Somewhere in the distance, I heard wolves. The sound brought back memories of camping with my father when I was younger. For a moment, I almost felt like he was there with me again. I reached into my backpack and pulled out the notebook. The next page contained a rule I didn't remember reading before. Never leave the tent between 2 and 4 in the morning unless it is an emergency. Beneath it was a note written in my father's handwriting. Most emergencies during those hours are not yours. I checked the time. 9:47 p.m. The night had only just begun. That was when someone whistled. The sound came from somewhere deeper in the forest. The entire campground went silent, instantly. The conversation stopped. The laughter stopped. Even the children stopped talking. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then one by one, families began retreating into their tents without saying a word. Within less than 3 minutes, the campground was empty. I stood alone beside my campfire, staring at dozens of closed tents surrounding me. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, the whistle came again. This time it sounded closer. The second whistle echoed through the trees before fading into the night. Nobody reacted. At least, nobody reacted openly. The campground remained silent. The campfires that had been burning only minutes earlier were now little more than glowing embers. Flashlights disappeared. Lanterns switched off. Even the children, who had been laughing and running through the campsites moments before, had vanished into their tents. The change had happened too quickly to feel natural. It was as if everyone had rehearsed it. I looked around the campground. Dozens of tents, dozens of vehicles. Not a single person visible. Only me. For the first time that night, I opened my father's notebook with shaking hands. The rule was exactly where I remembered it. Never whistle after sunset. There was another sentence beneath it. If you hear whistling after sunset, do not answer it. Do not imitate it. Do not try to locate the source. Most importantly, do not whistle back. I looked toward the trees surrounding the campground. The forest stood still beneath the moonlight. Nothing moved between the trunks. Then the whistle came again. Closer. Much closer. This time it sounded as though it had come from somewhere near the campground entrance. The tune itself was simple, almost cheerful. The sort of melody someone might absent-mindedly whistle while walking home from work. That somehow made it worse. I waited. The whistle came again. Closer still. It was moving. steadily enough that I could track its progress around the edge of the campground. My first instinct was to reach for my flashlight. My second was to grab my phone. I did neither. Instead, I listened. The sound continued circling the campsites, always remaining just beyond the nearest trees, always remaining hidden. Then the whistle changed direction. It was coming toward me. I stood up from my chair without realizing it. The sound approached the rear of my campsite. 10 feet away, 5 feet away, then it stopped. I stared into the darkness behind my tent. Nothing. Only trees and shadows. I waited for another whistle. Instead, I heard footsteps. Walking around the outside of my campsite. The footsteps crossed behind my tent, passed beside my truck, moved past the picnic table, then disappeared toward the neighboring campsites. I listened. No tent zippers opened. No one called out. No one reacted at all. The footsteps continued moving deeper into the campground. Then they stopped. Several seconds passed. Then I heard the whistle again. This time it came from much farther away. The sound slowly faded into the distance until it disappeared entirely. The campground remained silent for almost another 10 minutes. Then, gradually, life returned. A tent zipper opened somewhere nearby. A lantern switched back on. Someone added wood to a fire. Conversations resumed. Within 15 minutes, it was almost as though nothing had happened. Almost. The father from the campsite across from mine stepped outside for a moment and looked toward the trees. His expression was relief. The expression of someone who had been waiting for something to leave. I looked down at my father's notebook again. A new sentence had caught my attention. I was almost certain it had not been there earlier. Most people hear it only once. If you hear it twice in the same night, leave the park before sunrise. My eyes moved to the next line. If it stops outside your campsite, it already knows where you are. At that exact moment, something tapped softly against the canvas of my tent. The sound came from inside, not outside. For several seconds, I stared at the tent. The sound had been unmistakable, a single tap. Soft enough that I might have ignored it under different circumstances, but clear enough that I knew exactly where it had come from. The inside of the tent, I waited for another sound. Nothing came. The campground around me had almost completely returned to normal. Conversations drifted through the trees. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed at a joke I couldn't hear. A truck engine started near the campground exit before disappearing into the distance. Ordinary sounds. Comforting sounds. I kept my eyes fixed on the tent. The zipper remained exactly where I had left it. The fabric never moved. The beam from my lantern illuminated only the front half of the tent, leaving the rear hidden in shadow. I told myself there was an explanation. A bag falling over. A sleeping pad shifting. The cooling night air tightening the fabric. Any of those possibilities made more sense than what my mind wanted me to believe. I stood up and walked toward it. Halfway there, I stopped. The notebook. I had almost forgotten about it. I flipped through the pages until I found the section covering campsites. There were only 2 rules. Never enter another campsite without permission. Never investigate noises coming from your own tent if you know you were not inside it when the sound was made. My heartbeat quickened. The sentence beneath it had been added in different handwriting. The tent belongs to whatever is inside it until sunrise. I slowly lowered the notebook. That was impossible. Ridiculous. I'd set the tent up myself. I had left it empty less than an hour earlier. Another tap came from the canvas. This one came from the rear corner of the tent. Then another. Each tap was separated by several seconds. Almost patient. Almost polite. I backed away from the campsite until I reached my truck. I considered walking over to one of the neighboring campsites and asking whether they had experienced anything similar. The thought disappeared almost immediately. If everyone else knew the rules, they probably knew better than to interfere. The tapping stopped. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion began winning the argument against fear. I grabbed a blanket from the truck and spread it across the front seat. If the tent wanted to belong to something else until sunrise, it could have it. I had no intention of arguing over ownership. The hours passed slowly. Sometime after midnight, I woke to movement outside the truck. Footsteps. Circling the campsite, I remembered one of the rules I'd overheard earlier that evening. Count the footsteps before opening the tent. If more footsteps leave than arrive, stay inside until morning. I counted. 1 set approaching, 2 sets leaving. The footsteps continued around the campsite. 1 approaching, 3 leaving. My mouth suddenly felt dry. I had only heard 1 whistle earlier. Only 1 set of footsteps had entered the campsite. That wasn't what I was hearing now. The sounds continued for nearly 20 minutes. Every arrival added more departures. Every approach created more footsteps walking away into the darkness. I stopped counting after 12. Eventually, the sounds faded. The campground became silent once again. I checked the dashboard clock. 1:47 a.m., 13 more minutes remained before the hours my father had always warned me about. 2 until 4. Never leave the tent between those hours unless it is an emergency. I looked around the truck. The flashlight sat beside me. The keys remained in the ignition. The notebook rested on the passenger seat. Everything was fine. Then the smell arrived. Smoke. Not campfire smoke. Something stronger. Something closer. I looked through the windshield toward my campsite. My tent was burning. Flames climbed the fabric with impossible speed, throwing orange light across the trees and nearby campsites. For a moment, every rule disappeared from my mind. There was only one thought left. My father's notebook was still inside. My hand reached for the door handle. Then I remembered the time. 1:59 a.m. My hand remained on the door handle. The flames outside climbed higher, swallowing the tent so quickly that it looked less like a fire and more like something unfolding. The fabric collapsed inward as the orange glow spread across the campsite, casting shadows between the trees. My father's notebook was still inside. Every instinct I had was telling me to get out. The rule was telling me not to. Never leave the tent between 2 and 4 in the morning unless it is an emergency. The wording suddenly mattered more than ever. A fire was an emergency. A burning tent was an emergency. The notebook was important, but not important enough to die for. I looked at the dashboard clock. 2 a.m. exactly. The second the numbers changed, the fire disappeared. One moment flames were reaching above the trees. The next moment the campsite was dark. I stared through the windshield. My tent stood exactly where it had been before, untouched. The fabric wasn't blackened. The guide ropes weren't damaged. Even the camping chair beside the fire pit remained where I had left it earlier that evening. There was no smoke, no smell, no heat, nothing. I checked the clock again. 2:01 a.m. The rule wasn't keeping me inside because something dangerous might happen outside. The rule was keeping me inside because something dangerous would make me want to leave. The next hour passed slowly. Sleep was impossible. Every few minutes I checked the time, waiting for the numbers to move faster than they did. Outside, the campground remained silent. It felt as though the entire park had stopped breathing. At 2:37 a.m., I heard my father's voice. It came from somewhere near the fire pit. I froze immediately. The voice sounded exactly as I remembered. He spoke calmly, patiently. The voice asked me to come outside. It said I had forgotten something important near the campfire. I shut my eyes. The voice came again, closer this time. It sounded as though he was standing beside the truck. I remembered another rule. Never trust a voice simply because you recognize it. That rule had never been in the notebook. That one had belonged to my father alone. The voice moved to the driver's side window, then the passenger side, then behind the truck. There were no footsteps between positions. The voice simply appeared somewhere else each time it spoke. I kept my eyes fixed on the dashboard clock. 2:51 a.m. The minutes crawled by. The voice stopped. Then something tapped against the truck window. 3 taps. Soft, measured. I refused to look. Another 3 taps followed. Then another. The tapping moved slowly around the truck. Driver's side, passenger side, rear window, windshield. Each time it stopped, it resumed somewhere else. Whatever was outside never rushed. The tapping finally stopped at 3:16 a.m. The silence returned. I waited another 10 minutes before risking a glance outside. The campsite looked normal. The tent stood untouched. The trees swayed gently in the wind. Nothing moved between them. I checked the notebook again. A sentence had been written beneath the rule in handwriting I didn't recognize. Most people who leave between 2 and 4 in the morning never realize they left. I closed the notebook immediately. The eastern horizon had started to brighten slightly. That was when I heard something moving through the trees behind the campsite. Breathing. Heavy breathing. The kind made by something large after a long run. I looked toward the darkness beyond the last row of trees. Then I saw eyes. Not one pair. Several. They stood motionless at the edge of the forest, reflecting the moonlight. Slowly, one of the shapes stepped forward into the clearing. It was an elk. At least it looked like an elk, until it stood up. I remembered Rule 3 immediately. If you ever see an animal standing on 2 legs, do not run. Do not approach it. Do not look at it for longer than a few seconds. Walk away and keep your eyes on the trail. The problem was that there was no trail, and the thing standing at the edge of the trees was looking directly at me. For a moment, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. Everything about the animal looked correct until it reached the shoulders. The antlers were real. The fur was real. The shape of its head was real. Only the posture was wrong. It stood upright with its front legs hanging loosely at its sides, as though it had simply decided to stop pretending to be an animal. The creature remained still at the edge of the trees. So did I. Then I remembered the rule. Do not run. Do not approach it. Do not look at it for longer than a few seconds. Walk away and keep your eyes on the trail. The problem was that I wasn't on a trail. I was standing in a campground parking area with my truck behind me and the forest in front of me. For the first time in my life, I realized my father had probably expected me to understand the spirit of the rule rather than the exact wording. Do not engage with it. Do not acknowledge it. Leave. Slowly, without taking my eyes completely off the creature, I stepped backward toward the truck. The elk didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. The creature simply watched me. Its eyes reflected the moonlight with a brightness that didn't seem natural. They looked less like eyes and more like distant headlights shining through fog. I opened the truck door without looking away. The sound seemed loud in the quiet campground. The creature didn't react. I climbed inside and locked the doors. Only then did I allow myself to look away. Several seconds passed. When I finally looked back toward the tree line, the creature was gone. The clearing stood empty. The trees moved gently in the wind. Nothing else. I checked the dashboard clock. 3:41 a.m., less than 20 minutes remained before the restriction ended. I wasn't sure whether that thought comforted me or frightened me. The next 10 minutes passed in silence. Then I noticed movement near the neighboring campsite. The family with the 2 children had emerged from their tent. At first, I assumed they were preparing to leave early. Then I noticed the time. 3:53 a.m., no one should have been outside. The father walked slowly toward the edge of the campground. The mother followed. Then the children. They moved with the steady pace of sleepwalkers. None of them carried flashlights. None of them spoke. They simply walked toward the forest. My first instinct was to stop them. The second was to remember every rule I had heard since arriving in Yellowstone. Do not interfere. Do not investigate. Do not follow. The family reached the trees and disappeared between them without hesitation. I waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. No one returned. At 4:07 a.m., headlights appeared near the campground entrance. A park ranger vehicle rolled slowly down the road before stopping beside the empty campsite. A ranger stepped out and looked around the area with a flashlight. The sight of another person should have been reassuring. Instead, I remembered another rule. If you see a ranger near your campsite after midnight, check for a vehicle before speaking to them. There was a vehicle. The ranger spent several minutes examining the campsite before shining his flashlight toward the forest where the family had disappeared. He stood there for a long time. Eventually, he lowered the flashlight and returned to his truck. He didn't enter the woods. He didn't call for them. He didn't seem surprised that an entire family had vanished from their campsite before sunrise. The vehicle drove away. The campsite remained empty. I looked toward the notebook on the passenger seat. For the first time, I noticed another page folded into the back cover. The handwriting belonged to my father. It contained only 2 sentences. Most people think the rules protect you from something in Yellowstone. That is not what the rules are for. I turned the page over. There was one final line written beneath it. The rules exist to help Yellowstone recognize that you do not belong to it. As I finished reading, I heard movement outside the truck. Footsteps. 4 sets of them. They were coming back from the forest. The footsteps moved slowly through the trees behind the campground. Crunch, 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 crunch. 4 separate rhythms. 4 separate sets of footsteps moving over leaves and gravel. I remained perfectly still inside the truck. My eyes stayed fixed on the tree line. A few seconds later, shapes began emerging from the darkness. The father appeared first. Then the mother. Then the little boy. They walked back into the campground with the same slow pace they had used when they entered the woods. The little girl came last. That should have been 4 people. That should have matched the 4 sets of footsteps. Instead, I remembered something. The father had walked first. The mother had followed. Then the children. I had watched them leave. There had only been 3 sets of footsteps. The little girl had never touched the ground. I remembered it clearly. She had been asleep. The father had been carrying her. 4 people had entered the woods. Only 3 sets of footsteps had gone in. Now 4 sets were coming back. The family returned to their campsite without saying a word. The parents entered their tent. The little boy entered next. The little girl stopped at the entrance. She turned toward my truck. Even from that distance, I could tell she was looking directly at me. Then she stepped inside. The zipper closed. The campground became silent once more. I checked the clock. 4:16 a.m. The rule covering the hours between 2 and 4 had ended. For some reason that no longer felt important. I reached for the notebook again. My father had left notes beside most of the rules. Not this one. Not a single page mentioned families walking into the woods. Not a single story mentioned children returning differently. Then I found the final section. The pages looked newer than the others. The handwriting was my father's. The title read, "For those returning after a long absence, there were only 3 rules. Do not stay after your first sunrise. Do not return to the same campsite twice. If you notice someone recognizing you before you recognize them, leave the park immediately." I frowned. That last one made no sense. How would I even know? The answer arrived almost immediately. Headlights appeared near the campground entrance. Another vehicle was arriving. The truck rolled slowly past my campsite before stopping beside the empty space next to mine. An older man stepped out and began unloading equipment. At first I paid little attention. Then he looked toward me. His expression changed instantly. "Recognition." He smiled, raised one hand, then walked directly toward my truck. I rolled down the window slightly. The man studied my face for several seconds. His expression slowly disappeared. He looked confused now, almost disappointed. Without saying anything else, he turned around and walked back to his campsite. The encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. My heart continued racing long after it ended. The man had known me, I was sure of it. The problem was that I had never seen him before in my life. I checked the notebook again. Beneath the final rule, my father had written one final note. This usually begins on the second day. I looked up slowly. Second day. I had only arrived yesterday afternoon. Sunrise had not happened yet. That meant whatever was happening was early. Much earlier than my father expected. The eastern sky was beginning to brighten. Morning was coming. For the first time all night, I thought I had made it. Then I noticed movement near the campground entrance. People were gathering. Families. Dozens of them. Men, women, children. They stood silently beside the road leading out of the campground. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They simply watched the campsites as the first sunlight touched the mountains. One by one, campers began stepping out of their tents. None of them seemed to notice the crowd watching them. Only I could see them. I knew that with absolute certainty. Because one of the people standing near the road was my father. He looked exactly the way he had looked this summer before he died, and he was smiling directly at me. My father stood near the campground entrance, among dozens of strangers, who looked as though they had been standing there for hours waiting for the sun to rise. He looked exactly as I remembered him. The same hiking jacket, the same baseball cap, the same expression he used to wear whenever I struggled to set up camp as a child and refused to ask for help. There was no difference. No sign of age. No sign of illness. No sign that he had been dead for almost a month. I looked away immediately. When I looked back, he was still there. So were the others. Men, women, children, entire families standing silently beneath the trees. The strangest part was that none of them looked threatening. They looked patient, as though they had gathered for something that had not started yet. Campers slowly began emerging from their tents. Parents stretched beside campfires. Children ran between picnic tables. Coffee makers hissed to life. The campground was waking up. No one reacted to the crowd standing near the road. No one acknowledged them. The families near the entrance may as well have been invisible. I checked the notebook again. A new page had slipped loose from between the others. The paper was folded twice. The handwriting belonged to my father. If you see them after sunrise, do not wave. Do not approach them. Most importantly, do not let them know you recognize them. My eyes moved to the sentence beneath it. They are not trying to come back. They are trying to see who still remembers them. I looked toward my father again. He hadn't moved. Neither had anyone else. The crowd remained perfectly still while the campground slowly came to life around them. Then something happened. A little boy stepped out of one of the nearby tents carrying a toy truck. He looked no older than 6. Without hesitation, he waved toward the crowd near the entrance. My stomach tightened. An older woman standing near my father slowly raised her hand and waved back. The boy smiled, then he walked toward her. His parents never noticed. They were busy unpacking supplies from their car. The boy crossed the road, reached the tree line, and disappeared behind the people standing there. His parents continued unloading their vehicle. 30 seconds later, the mother looked around, then looked around again. Within minutes, the entire campsite was searching. The father checked nearby bathrooms. The mother called the boy's name repeatedly. Campers joined the search. Park rangers arrived. Questions were asked. Descriptions were given. The crowd near the entrance never moved. My father remained among them, watching, waiting. By noon, helicopters were flying over the forest. Search teams moved through the trails. The official explanation came quickly. The child had wandered away. Children wandered away in national parks all the time. Everyone accepted the explanation except me, because I had seen where he went. More importantly, I had seen who he went with. The search continued into the evening. By sunset, the campground had changed completely. The laughter was gone. The conversations were quieter. Parents stayed closer to their children. Several families packed their belongings and left early. The family across from me stayed. The same family whose daughter had returned from the woods with an extra set of footsteps. The little girl sat near the fire staring into the trees, as though she was watching movement nobody else could see. At exactly sunset, she stood up, walked over to her father, and whispered something into his ear. His expression changed immediately. He looked toward the forest, then toward the mountains, then toward the sky. Without saying a word to anyone else, he began packing their campsite. Within 20 minutes, they were gone. They left food behind. They left supplies behind. They even left one of their chairs behind. Whatever the little girl had told him had been important enough to abandon everything else. That night, I opened my father's notebook again. A final page had been tucked into the back cover. The paper was older than the others. The handwriting wasn't my father's. It belonged to whoever had written the first entry back in 1947. The note contained only one sentence. Yellowstone does not take people. Yellowstone keeps the ones who agree to stay. Below it, in my father's handwriting, was a final addition. Most of them don't realize they agreed. I read the sentence 3 times before closing the notebook. Outside, somewhere deep in the forest, someone whistled. The sound came only once. This time it sounded almost like a warning. I did not sleep that night. The whistle never came again. Silence left too much room for thought. I sat inside the truck with my father's notebook resting on the passenger seat and watched darkness settle over the campground for the second time since arriving. The families around me behaved differently now. Parents called their children back earlier than the night before. Campfires burned lower. Conversations stayed quieter. It felt less like a campground and more like a town waiting for a storm everyone knew was coming. The family across from me never returned. Their campsite remained exactly as they had left it. One chair sat beside a cold fire pit. A half-empty bag of marshmallows rested on the picnic table. A blanket hung over the edge of the bench. Park rangers arrived shortly after sunrise and removed everything before noon. By evening, another family had already moved into the site. No one mentioned the people who had stayed there the day before. No one asked questions. No one seemed to remember they had ever existed. That frightened me more than anything else I'd experienced inside the park. People disappearing was terrifying. People forgetting they had disappeared was worse. As darkness fell, I opened my father's notebook again. Near the back, hidden between 2 pages, was an envelope I had somehow missed before. My name was written across the front. Inside was a single page. If you are reading this, it means you stayed past your first sunrise. That means the park has noticed you. I stopped reading for several seconds. Then I continued. The rules are not there to protect you from creatures, spirits, or monsters. The rules exist because Yellowstone behaves like an ecosystem. Everything inside it belongs to it eventually. Trees belong to it. Animals belong to it. The rivers belong to it. Some people belong to it too. My eyes moved to the next paragraph. Children survive more often because children follow rules they do not understand. Adults need explanations. Adults negotiate. Adults make exceptions. Children simply listen. I leaned back against the seat. For the first time, every rule my father had ever given me made sense. He had never expected me to understand them. He had only expected me to survive long enough that understanding would no longer matter. I continued reading. If you remain in the park after the second sunrise, you will begin noticing things before other people notice them. If you remain after the third, other things will begin noticing you. Leave before the third sunrise. Do not convince yourself you need answers. That is how most people stay. I looked at the dashboard clock. 11:17 p.m. tomorrow morning would be my second sunrise. I had 1 day left. Outside, movement caught my attention. The little girl from the family that had left the campground stood beside the empty campsite across from mine. She looked exactly the same. Same jacket, same hair, same expression. The only difference was that she was alone. She stared directly at my truck for several seconds. Then she pointed toward the forest, simply pointing, as though she wanted me to notice something. Against my better judgment, I looked. Dozens of figures stood between the trees. Men, women, children, entire families. Some wore modern clothing. Others looked decades out of place, Hiking gear from the 70s, camping equipment from the 80s, clothing styles that had disappeared long before I was born. Every one of them stood perfectly still, watching the campground, watching the living, watching the people who still had time left to leave. My eyes searched the crowd until they landed on my father. He was standing closer than he had been that morning. Much closer. For the first time since I had seen him, his expression changed. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked worried. Slowly, he shook his head. Once, twice, the same gesture he used to make when I was about to do something stupid as a child. Leave. That was what he was trying to tell me. Leave before I became part of the crowd standing between the trees. Leave before Yellowstone decided I belonged to it too. I started the truck immediately. I didn't care that it was almost midnight. I didn't care that I had planned to stay another day. I didn't care that half my equipment was still outside. For the first time since arriving, I finally understood the purpose of the rules. The rules were never instructions for surviving Yellowstone. They were instructions for escaping it before it convinced you to stay.